Thank you for tuning in to our virtual rendition of a popular extension class, Poison in the Pasture, Practical Steps to Identify, Eradicate, and Prevent Dangerous Weeds in Central Florida Pastures. My name is Meg Mann, and I have the great pleasure of serving as the Livestock and Pasture Agent in beautiful Lake County, Florida. I always like to start my programs by sharing a little about Cooperative Extension in Florida, in case this is your first time attending one of our classes. As one of Florida's 2 land-grant universities, the University of Florida is charged with a threefold mission of teaching, research, and extension. Teaching takes place primarily on our campus in Gainesville, though currently our students, like many of you, have transitioned to learning remotely in response to COVID-19. Research also takes place on campus, as well as around the state at our research and education centers. Extension, the third branch of the land-grant system, combines the research and teaching being done on campus and makes it available to everyone in Florida. In effect, the Extension Service extends the resources of the entire university to every Floridian. Each of Florida's 67 counties has an Extension office. My office in Lake County is shown here. At the time of this recording, April 9th, 2020, most of our offices are physically closed to the public, but our agents are still very much hard at work. I am proud to be an extension agent and prouder still to be part of a network of livestock extension agents in Central Florida. Together we make up the aptly named Central Florida Livestock Agents Group, or CFLAG. We work cooperatively to bring high-quality programming to our shared clientele and share our personal expertise across a wider network. This program is one such example. In ordinary times, this class would be offered in person, but these are not ordinary times, so we had to get a little creative. We hope you'll enjoy this new approach to bringing you extension education and welcome your feedback, suggestions, and constructive criticisms. Before we get started, you should know that this class will take you about an hour to complete. That said, you don't need to do it all in one sitting. In fact, I would encourage you to watch a little, press pause, take a break to digest what you learned, then come back for more. You will want some paper and something to write with to take notes. And I'll be including links to references material in the description for this video, so be sure to check there for more details. Before we get started, I want to give a quick disclaimer. I am not going to cover everything you need to know about pasture management in this course. That's a PhD program and way beyond the scope of this one class. In the interest of time, I'll be focusing on toxic plants that are most common and/or problematic in Central Florida pastures. In no way, shape, or form am I going to be able to cover every poisonous plant known to man. In other words, just because I don't mention it doesn't mean it's not a problem. We're going to start off today by establishing why toxic weeds are a problem and why livestock producers and horse owners should be familiar with their identification and management, even if they don't believe they are having a problem with them. We'll also discuss where weeds come from and why animals eat them. From there, we'll move into a discussion about what it means for something to be toxic and why it's so hard for us to say just how much of a particular plant an animal needs to eat in order to suffer ill effects. Next, we'll jump into the stuff you guys have probably tuned in for, the identification. Specifically, we'll be looking at 16 common toxic plants, learning to visually ID them, and developing a basic familiarity with their symptoms. Finally, we'll discuss control options, including cultural, mechanical, and chemical methods. Raise your hand if you have ever had an animal die from eating a poisonous plant. Okay, so I can't actually see any of you right now, but dollars to donuts, most of you don't have your hands up. And that's because most of the time the consumption of poisonous plants does not lead to immediate death. So, same exercise. Do you think you have a problem with toxic plants? A lot more of your hands should be going up. Just because you haven't lost an animal doesn't mean you haven't been negatively impacted by toxic plants. Animal loss really is just the tip of the iceberg. For sure, it's the most visible part of your problem, but underlying it are negative impacts on animal health and performance. So maybe your cow is alive, but she's unthrifty and won't breed back. Or your horse is alive, but won't keep weight on him no matter what you do. All weeds, including toxic weeds, compete with desired forage for limited nutrients, moisture, and light. So if you have 5 acres of pasture, but 20% of it is made up of weeds, then you really only have 4 acres of grazable land. Weeds can also discourage grazing, particularly if they have thorns or strong odors, like many of our toxic friends do. So now you have given up even more grazable land because animals are resistant to eating in the vicinity of some of these plants. When we are not in the midst of a global pandemic, I spend a lot of my time visiting farms and doing on-site consultations. This is one of my favorite parts of my job because I'm able to diagnose problems and prescribe science-based solutions that save money and resources. Plus, I get to see your horses and livestock and pet your dogs, which makes for a pretty darn good day in the office. I'll typically find between 5 to 10 species of toxic plants per farm on properties that did not call me out because they thought they were having a weed problem. And I am surprised at the length that some folks will go to defend their weeds. I promise I have heard it all. I also promise that I am not judging you. Here are a couple of common misconceptions that I would like to debunk. My horse knows not to eat poisonous plants. No, he does not. Now, most weeds are not palatable, meaning they don't taste good, so given the choice, most animals will select grass or hay over a toxic plant, but they are ignorant regarding the danger of toxic weeds. Another one I hear a lot is that the plant has been there forever and that they leave it alone. Okay, that might be the case, but do you really know that? For sure? Do you watch them 24 hours a day? I mean, you might now if you're home on quarantine, but ordinarily, and even if they've never eaten it before, does that guarantee that they'll never eat it in the future? And are you willing to bet the health of your animals on that? The only way they will learn is by eating it. No, not at all, not even a little bit. For one thing, animal brains typically don't understand a delayed cause and effect very well. And if we're totally honest, neither do human brains. There is also some evidence that consumption of toxic plants can be habit-forming. And while most plants are not acutely toxic, there are some that take very little to kill. Regardless of your reason for defending the toxic weeds on your property, I would argue that they are not worth the risk. If they haven't caused issues yet, then count your blessings, but don't count on your luck to hold out forever. So, where do weeds come from? Well, lots of places. Many of them have been on your property for longer than you have. They exist in what we call the soil seed bank, as dormant seeds waiting for the right conditions to germinate. Some seeds are designed to travel great distances on the wind and may blow in from all directions. Many are carried in the digestive tracts of birds. Avian digestive tracts are short by design. It's hard to fly when you're full of poop, and they excrete waste products at frequent intervals. It's not uncommon to find toxic plants along fence rows that were planted by birds who stopped to perch and poop there. Toxic plants can also be brought onto your property in hay, though I think this avenue gets more blame than it deserves. Hay producers go to great lengths to control weeds in their fields, though some do slip through. It is a good practice to visually inspect your hay and remove any foreign material prior to feeding it. We are often guilty of accidentally planting seeds that we carry in on the tread of our tires or bottom of our boots or on our mower blades. And sometimes we accidentally plant them by not thoroughly researching the ornamental landscaping plants we select prior to tackling a project around the barn. Finally, some weeds were once intentionally planted but escaped cultivation, as is the case with many of our invasive species. There is some value in understanding where weeds come from so that we can exercise control in those areas that we have some control. For example, we can make a practice of cleaning mower blades between fields to ensure that we don't transfer weeds from one area to another. In general, toxic weeds are not palatable, meaning they don't taste good. Given the choice, most animals will avoid consuming them. Yet, we know that many do eat them, which begs the question, why? Many times they are simply hungry. There's either not enough grass available to graze, or the grass is so low in terms of nutrition that the animals are forced to try and meet their needs elsewhere. Anecdotally, I see the majority of plant poisonings in the fall for this reason. Our Bahia pastures are still green, but they have gone dormant and are no longer growing at a rapid pace. Overstocked pastures have been grazed down to nubs, and what grass does remain is low in both crude protein and energy. Now that weed that was ignored all summer starts to look awfully tempting. Of course, it's not only hunger that drives animals to eat toxic plants. Some are just curious. Animals lack hands, so they explore the world around them with their mouths, and some do a lot more exploring than others. We have all probably had that one horse or heifer that just seems to get into everything, and that type of individual is going to be more prone to exploring new plants or fallen branches in their pasture as well. Sometimes we feed poisonous plants, though hopefully not on purpose. I have heard stories of well-meaning neighbors picking azaleas and feeding them over the fence to goats. If you share a fence line with people who are not animal savvy, it may be a good idea to have a conversation with them about not feeding your animals anything, or alternatively, you could provide them with treats that are okay to feed. We can also sometimes feed toxic plants in hay, though this is somewhat uncommon. Still, it's a good idea to visually inspect any hay you feed prior to offering it to your stock. Finally, there is some evidence that the consumption of certain toxic plants can be habit-forming. We have seen animals pulled off a pasture after an episode of poisoning return immediately to where the offending plant was located as soon as they recover. If you think about it, it makes some degree of sense. A lot of toxic substances, like, for example, alcohol, can be habit-forming. If an animal feels intoxicated immediately after consuming a certain plant, they may be apt to repeat the behavior, even if doing so leads them to feeling like garbage the next day. They are unable to make the association between what they ate, or the cause, and how they feel later, the effect. So now that we understand why animals eat toxic plants, let's talk about who tends to get sick. In general, and this is not true for all cases, the very young and very old will be most susceptible to the effects of poisoning. Likewise, any animal that is immunocompromised or stressed could be expected to exhibit more symptoms. There is also some evidence that animals that have been newly introduced to an area are more likely to be poisoned, likely as a function of their exploring their new environment via their mouth. Before we get into identifying plants, it is important to develop a basic understanding of some terms around toxicity. When we talk about the effects of a toxic plant, we often refer to it as being either chronic or acute. Chronic refers to a situation where an animal is eating a small amount over a long period of time, where acute often involves an animal eating a larger amount in a short period of time. Chronic effects are long-lasting and acute effects are immediate. We can also think of a toxin as having cumulative effects, meaning it is able to build on itself. So each dose adds up until a critical threshold is met. One of the most common questions I'm asked about toxic plants is, how much does my horse need to eat in order to get sick? And the answer is the favorite go-to of all extension agents everywhere. It depends. The dose does indeed make the poison, and the dose rate depends on the size of the animal, their age, their overall health, their individual genetic predisposition, their ability to metabolize toxins, and a number of other factors. The final term we need to understand is rate of consumption, or the amount consumed over a given period. This will have an impact on the severity of symptoms and dictate whether you are dealing with an acute or chronic case. If you have a sudden onset of unexplained symptoms affecting some, but typically not all, of your animals, you may be right to suspect plant poisoning. Common symptoms of acute poisoning may include things like head pressing, when an animal stands with their forehead pressed against a vertical surface like a fence post, lethargy, ataxia or a wobbly gait, trembling, changes in the color of urine or consistency of feces, sensitivity to light, water on the belly, or difficulty breathing. Signs that your animal may have been eating smaller amounts over a longer period of time could include weight loss or general unthriftiness, a poor hair coat, changes in temperament, waves of colic that seem to come and go with no cause, and blistering around the lips and gums. Now, not all of these symptoms are associated with all plants, and we'll discuss individual plants in just a few minutes, but these are good red flags to be aware of. So what do you do if you suspect your animal has been poisoned? First thing you need to do is remove them from the area. Remember we talked about poisonous plant consumption being potentially habit forming? Don't give them the opportunity to continue eating it. You'll want to reach out to your vet as soon as possible, but before you do so, it's a good idea to establish a list of symptoms and take temperature, pulse, and respiration rate if possible, as these are all things your vet will likely ask you about over the phone. If you can identify the plant that they ate, that can be extremely helpful in terms of helping your vet establish a treatment protocol. Unfortunately, it can sometimes be hard to know exactly what was eaten if you have multiple possibilities. Additionally, sometimes you won't be able to find what they ate because they ate all of it. Let's jump into identification. I have 16 plants for you to ID, and you're going to have the chance to test your skills first. I'll provide 30 seconds on each of these next 16 slides, but feel free to hit the pause button if you need a longer time. Write down their number and what you think they are so you can grade yourself later on. Ready, set, go. So, how did you do? Did any of them look familiar? Did you know any of them by name? Let's start with our herbs, shrubs, ferns, and grasses. Mystery plant number 1 is sicklepod. Sicklepod gets its common name from the sickle-shaped seed pod that it bears. The Latin name, Senna obtusifolia, means that it's an aromatic or stinky plant with blunt leaves. Consumption of this plant can lead to damage to the liver, kidneys, and muscle tissues. The breakdown of muscle causes a release of myoglobin in the urine, causing it to turn a dark brown or coffee color. For this reason, sicklepod is often referred to as a coffee weed. Symptoms of ingestion include diarrhea, anorexia or loss of appetite, lethargy, and tremors in the hind legs. Next up is a plant that is often mistaken for sicklepod and shares the nickname coffee weed. Mystery plant number 2 is coffee senna. You can see here that coffee senna has a pointed leaf and upright seed pod, as opposed to the blunt leaf and drooping seed pod of sicklepod. For all intents and purposes, coffee senna poisoning is very similar to sicklepod poisoning and can result in the same coffee-colored urine. It does tend to be less common, but more severe when compared to sicklepod. Mystery plant number 3 is one of the more dangerous plants that we have in the state of Florida, and that it is associated with a large number of animal losses every year. This is showy crotalaria. Crotalaria is also known as rattlebox for the sound that the dried seed pods make in the wind. Consumption of this plant causes irreversible damage to the liver because it interferes with the ability of the liver cells to regenerate. Toxicity has a cumulative effect. An animal who eats a large amount at one time would very quickly show signs of acute liver failure, but it is more common to see animals eat very low levels over weeks or even years who gradually develop liver failure. Symptoms include diarrhea, anorexia and associated weight loss, a yellowing of the eyes and gums, fever, mild colic symptoms that come and go, increased sensitivity to light, and an array of neurological symptoms, including head pressing and ataxia. Mystery plant number 4 is pokeweed, also known as pokeberry. Here you can see it in a couple different stages of growth. The immature plant starts out really fleshy and green, but becomes more woody with the stem turning a brilliant reddish purple as it matures. Pokeweed is incredibly common in pastures and can cause colic-like symptoms when consumed. Animals may suffer from irritation around the lips and gums that leads to excess salivation. They may or may not experience diarrhea, which can be bloody. If they eat enough at one time or over a long period of time and die, a necropsy will show ulcers, hemorrhage, and evidence of liver damage. Next up is mystery plant number 5, pigweed or spiny amaranth. Pigweed has earned the nickname careless weed for its habit of popping up in places that we have been careless with our pasture management. It generally won't outcompete healthy stands of forage, but will readily take advantage of areas that have been overgrazed or left bare. If consumed, pigweed can cause the development of kidney disease, signs of which include weakness, trembling, unsteadiness, knuckling, and paralysis. Pigweed can become more dangerous under heavy fertilization or when treated with certain herbicides, because it can accumulate nitrates and lead to nitrate poisoning. Symptoms of nitrate intoxication can include weakness, staggering, foamy salivations, and dark mucous membranes. Next up is a plant that has gained a certain amount of notoriety in recent years. Mystery plant number 6 is creeping indigo. Creeping indigo is easy to spot if you know what you're looking for, and readily confused with other plants if you don't. The important thing to remember is that it creeps along the ground. You'll not see it growing tall and bushy like its harmless cousin hairy indigo. While it is more palatable than some other toxic weeds, it is typically not consumed in any significant quantity, provided there is enough available forage. Where you can run into trouble is when you have a situation with an overgrazed pasture, a lot of creeping indigo, and hungry horses. Ingestion of creeping indigo causes both neurological and non-neurological symptoms. Non-neuro signs include weight loss, increased pulse and respiration, pale gums, bad breath, watery eyes, light sensitivity and squinting, especially when moving from areas of low light to bright light, opaque corneas, and ulcers on the tongue and gums. You'll sometimes also find a prominent digital pulse in the absence of other symptoms of laminitis. Neurological signs include depression, a drooping head carriage, head pressing, a reduced menace response, meaning they don't react to sudden movement in front of their face, and changes to gait and posture. People tend to get hyper-focused on creeping indigo because it has gotten a lot of attention on social media. And while it is bad, I hope this presentation will help you appreciate that it's not the only plant you need to be paying attention to. Mystery plant number 7 causes a lot of issues in Central Florida, and that is nightshade, including black nightshade, American nightshade, and eastern black nightshade. Animals who consume nightshade will initially display excited behavior, followed by pronounced depression and a decreased pulse. At the same time, they'll exhibit muscle weakness, dilated pupils, gastrointestinal upset, and watery stools. If the rate of consumption is high enough, they may experience cardiac arrest prior to the onset of any GI symptoms. Next up is a plant we should all know and hate, Lantana. Lantana is an invasive exotic, meaning that it is not native to Florida, but grows really, really well here. So well, in fact, that it can outcompete other plants and will thrive in soils that other plants struggle in. Lantana is difficult to eradicate and can spread quickly. If you have a little now, you are well served to act to remove it before a little turns into a lot. It is also wise to learn to ID Lantana without the flowers, as this will allow you to find the immature plants and target them for removal. One of the easiest ways to ID Lantana is by its smell. If you tear a leaf and take a whiff, it has an odor that you won't soon forget. While Lantana is thought to be unpalatable, it is occasionally eaten in high enough quantities to cause acute toxicity. I am personally aware of one case where newly weaned calves took shelter under an oak tree during a 4-day rain event. The only thing under the tree available for them to eat was Lantana, and 4 of the 5 calves did not survive. Symptoms of acute poisoning include general gastric distress with bloody and/or watery diarrhea, weakness and paralysis of the hind limbs, with death following between 7 and 10 days after initial symptoms. More often, animals suffer from the chronic impacts of eating small amounts of Lantana over time. The most pronounced symptom of this is hyperphotosensitization, or increased sun sensitivity. Animals will become badly sunburnt along non-pigmented areas of their body, with skin eventually ulcerating and sloughing off. They are then prone to complications from secondary infections of these wounds. Mystery plant number 9 is one that vexed Florida ranchers for a long time. Fortunately, we have some pretty good control methods for dealing with tropical soda apple nowadays. The apples of tropical soda apple are readily eaten, and the seeds can be spread in the manure of animals who consume them. TSA is in the nightshade family, and the effects of eating its leaves are very similar to nightshade consumption and poisoning. Mystery plant number 10 is the stuff of spy novels and old-time medicine adverts. Castor bean was originally grown to make castor oil, but has since become invasive and now grows throughout Central Florida. Ricin, the deadly toxin used in terrorist plots, is made from its seeds. Animals who consume castor bean will suffer from GI upset and experience bouts of straining and bloody diarrhea. They typically exhibit weakness, trembling, and a general lack of coordination. Next up is mystery plant number 11, Perilla Mint. Perilla Mint has a minty odor and a distinctive reddish-colored square-shaped stem. The flowers have the highest concentration of toxin, although the entire plant can be toxic. Symptoms include respiratory distress with a distinctive grunting sound made on exhale, a runny nose, and fluid on the lungs. Our next mystery plant is one of the most interesting in my opinion. Bracken Fern causes two totally different syndromes depending on what animal species consumes it. Monogastrics, animals with a single chambered stomach, are a class of livestock that includes horses and swine. They can suffer from a condition called Bracken staggers when they consume bracken fern at a rate of 20% or more of the diet for 3 or more months. Clinical signs include anorexia, weight loss, incoordination, a classical arched back stance, and tremors when moving. Tachycardia and arrhythmias may present as the disease progresses. Death, which typically occurs between 2 and 10 days after the onset of symptoms, is preceded by convulsions. Bracken staggers in monogastric animals is a result of bracken fern thiaminases, which block the absorption of vitamin B1 and cause a thiamine deficiency. B1 deficiency is typically not an issue in ruminant animals because the vitamin is synthesized in the rumen, but they do not get off scot-free. Ruminants who eat bracken fern over a long period of time, that includes cattle and sheep, will become weak, lose weight, and develop a high fever. They typically show signs of respiratory distress and will have pale mucous membranes. Hemorrhages will vary from minor mucosal petechia, which look like red speckling on the gums, to effusive bleeding. Blood clotting is delayed, and it's not uncommon to see these animals dripping blood from minor insect bites and scratches hours after the injury was incurred. Once affected, animals develop clinical signs. Bracken fern poisoning is almost always fatal. Necropsies will reveal multiple hemorrhages and bruising throughout the carcass. Even more worrying, there is some evidence that bracken fern has carcinogenic properties as well. Initial epidemiological studies have suggested that the consumption of milk from cattle with access to bracken fern increases risk of human esophageal and gastric cancers. Up next is Johnson grass, mystery plant number 13. When Johnson grass plant cells are wilted, frozen, chopped, or otherwise ruptured, the enzymes in the plant can rapidly form free cyanide gas. Plants less than 2 feet tall or stressed from drought, trampling, or frost tend to produce the most cyanide. Cyanide prevents hemoglobin from releasing oxygen to tissues, so the animal effectively dies from a lack of oxygen. Symptoms of cyanide toxicity can include acute, sudden death, preceded by respiratory distress, anxiety, and convulsions. The blood of these animals is a telltale bright cherry red color. Johnson grass can also accumulate nitrates after heavy fertilization. Excess nitrates result in the formation of methemoglobin from hemoglobin, a form which cannot transport oxygen. Symptoms are similar to cyanide toxicity, but the blood is a dark chocolate brown instead of cherry red. Next up, we have mystery plant number 14, Rosary Pea. Rosary Pea is native to India and parts of Southeast Asia. In Florida, it has become established as an incredibly invasive exotic plant. It likes to grow up trees and spread into the canopy where it drops its seeds. While the vine itself is not toxic, the pea contains abrin, one of the most toxic substances known to man. In fact, the fatal dose of abrin is 1/75th that of ricin, the toxin derived from Castor Bean and made famous by spy novels. Consumption at a rate of 0.00015% of body weight can be fatal. Though it is very rarely consumed by livestock, the fact that it is both highly deadly and highly invasive puts it on my list of weeds to worry about. Finally, we come to a couple of trees that I want to put on your radar. Starting with mystery plant number 15, black cherry tree. Both black cherry shown here and cherry laurel can be acutely toxic to all classes of livestock, with wilted leaves posing the greatest danger. Hydrogen cyanide compounds, more commonly called prussic acid, are formed when glycosides in the leaves are combined with hydrolytic enzymes in the leaves. These two compounds are normally stored in separate sites within the leaves, so hydrogen cyanide only forms when the barrier separating these sites is broken. This occurs when the plant tissue is damaged by chewing, frost, or damage to the tree that causes the leaves to wilt. Symptoms of intoxication occur quickly after ingestion, typically within 15 to 20 minutes, and include slobbering, increased respiration, weak pulse, convulsions, and bright red mucous membranes. The dose rate for cherry is not very high. About 1.2 pounds of wilted leaves is enough to do in your average 1,200-pound cow or horse. Cherry trees are very common in Central Florida pastures. Ideally, one would remove all cherry trees and replace them with a more benign species like live oak or sycamore. That said, the cost of doing so can be prohibitive. If you can't take out all your trees at once, you should at least make it a practice to check pastures after a storm or wind event and promptly remove any branches that have blown down. Not only are wilted branches more dangerous, they may also be more inviting to curious animals. Our final toxic plant to ID today is red maple, a tree that is harmless to ruminants but can be fatal to horses. Like cherry, red maple is most dangerous when the leaves are dried or wilted. Consumption of as little as 1.5 pounds of dried leaves can cause clinical signs, which may include weakness, depression, pale to yellow mucous membranes, dark-colored urine, and increased respiratory and heart rate. Red maple poisoning causes damage to the red blood cells in horses, which results in acute anemia. The dark red urine is a result of hemoglobin being released when red blood cells are destroyed. Although these are not what I would consider typical pasture plants, I feel I would be remiss in not mentioning the dangers of some of our ornamental plants. I have been on a number of farm calls where an animal was poisoned as a result of having been turned out to graze around the house. A good rule of thumb is if it's pretty, it's probably poisonous. Landscape plants which prove my point include oleander, pothos, azalea, lily, jessamine, sago palm, philodendron, caladium, mother-in-law's tongue, iris, daffodil, and rhododendron. So now that you have become more aware about the problem of toxic plants and learned to identify some common species, it's time to turn our attention to controlling toxic weeds, and really all undesirable weeds, in your pasture. Weed management is 3 separate and simultaneous processes that should be occurring on an ongoing basis. Weed management is not a one and done, set it and forget it, make one effort and walk away kind of deal. It is a constant process of identifying what you have, selecting the appropriate method for eradicating or controlling what you have identified, and continuously adopting practices to prevent weeds from growing in the first place. Correct identification is an important first step in developing a management plan. There is not a one-size-fits-all approach to weed management, and the method that you choose will depend largely on what weed you're trying to manage. It's a good practice to scout your property at least once per season. I appreciate that most of you are out in your pastures far more frequently than that, but I'm not talking about just being out in the field. I'm talking about taking an intentional, in-depth inventory of what you have. Walk the fence lines where birds may have deposited seeds, walk up and down your pastures, look at under tree canopies, part the grass, and see what might be growing closer to the ground. It's important to take this walk at least once every season because what you find in the summer will be different than what you see in the fall, which will be different than what you see in the winter, and so on. The good news is you don't have to memorize all the plants that grow in Central Florida. That's my job. You just need to know what grows on your property. And once you become familiar, you'll likely recognize the same plants coming back year after year, with some newcomers popping up every once in a while depending on weather trends. What if you find some plants in your pasture and have no idea what you're looking at? You can email your county extension agent good pictures to get help with identification. It's critical that you take and email high quality images if you want any chance at getting an accurate identification. This means that the images are clear and in focus. Ideally, you'll take some of the entire plant and some close-ups of any distinguishing features like flowers, seed pods, or berries. If possible, cut whatever you're shooting close-ups of and lay it on a white sheet of paper with a 1/4 for scale. This allows your agent to really see the details well and get a good idea of the size. In addition to pictures, include as much information as possible in your written description. Information like odor, sound, and texture do not translate visually. So what if you don't know who your county agent is? You can visit this website to find out. Or alternatively, give me a call in Lake County and I'd be happy to make the introduction. Now that you have identified your weed, you're ready to get rid of it. There are 3 basic categories of weed control available to you: mechanical, chemical, and biological. What you ultimately choose depends on a number of factors, but most heavily on what weed you're trying to control. Mechanical options include pulling the weed up and cutting the weed down. Pulling works well if you're dealing with a very small infestation, say just a couple of plants. It's important that you remove the entire plant, as many can grow back from bits of plant material left in the ground. It's also a good idea to wear gloves when pulling weeds, as some weeds can be skin irritants or have thorns. You'll want to be sure to remove the entire plant from your property and not just pull it and drop it where it is. Regular mowing can also be an effective means of weed control if the species that you're trying to control has an upright growth habit, so that you can continuously cut it back without scalping your grass. You'll also want to be sure that the weed has not already gone to seed prior to mowing, as you would just be spreading the seed in that case. We often think of mowing as being the least expensive weed control option available, and it is the first time you mow. But when you consider how often you'll need to mow to keep weeds at bay, and factor in the cost of fuel, wear and tear on your equipment, and the cost of your time, you may be surprised to find that the upfront cost of purchasing an herbicide ends up less expensive in the long run. Which brings us to chemical control. There are a number of herbicides available for pasture use in the state of Florida. The University of Florida publishes an annual weed management guide, which will be linked in the notes, that has a very useful table that cross-references common pasture weeds with herbicides approved for pasture use and rates them on their efficacy. Not all herbicides are designed to control all plants, so it's important that you have your weed correctly ID'd prior to making an herbicide selection. It's also important to remember that when it comes to herbicides, the label is not a suggestion, it is the law. Take the time to read the label before using any chemical and then follow it to the letter. Our final option, biological, is not available for all species of weeds and involves releasing biological controls, typically insects, to predate on targeted species. One example of this is the tropical soda apple beetle, which was released in the state of Florida to feed on the tropical soda apple. As the old adage goes, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and that is certainly true when it comes to pasture management. Anything that you can do to tip the scale in favor of your planted forages will decrease the incidence of weeds. I often say that weeds are not your problem. Weeds are just a symptom of your problem. Your real problem is pasture management. And the reason I say this is because a well-managed pasture will not have weed problems, or at least not major ones. If your pasture is being taken over by weeds, that should be a warning bell that something else is going off the rails. So how do we practice good pasture management? Well, that could be a whole other class or PhD program really, but to sum it up, pasture management is all about managing nutrients, both removals and deposits. We manage what is removed from the pasture by animals and by haymaking, and we manage what is deposited in terms of. Grazing management is really the foundation of pasture management, and it is at the root of 90% of pasture problems that I personally see. No amount of fertilizer or herbicide will fix poor grazing management. I'm going to say that one more time because it's really, really important. No amount of fertilizer or herbicide will make up for poor grazing management. When we are managing grazing, we are really managing the stubble height or amount of leaf tissue left on our grass plants. Bahia and Bermuda grasses, the predominant perennial pastures in Central Florida, prefer a stubble height of at least 3 to 4 inches. When grazed shorter than this for a prolonged period of time, they have to borrow energy from their root system to stay alive. If they borrow too much over too long a period of time, they'll not survive. Stocking rate refers to the number of animals that you can graze on a given piece of land. As extension agents, we're often asked how many cows, horses, goats, alpacas, etc. someone can have per acre, and the answer really is, guess what? It depends. It depends on the soil, the type of grass being grown, how much you supplement, how large your animals are, and a number of other factors. But as a general rule of thumb, you need a minimum of 2 acres of well-fertilized, weed-free, established Bahia grass pastures for every full-sized horse or cow-calf pair. This requirement can go up when you factor in weeds, sandy soils, bare spots, and weather conditions like droughts. I love using this graphic to illustrate my point about grazing management. On the left, you can see some grass that was not grazed. The middle patch has been grazed to an appropriate stubble height and allowed to rest, and the right has been overgrazed. When you look at the root system, you can see that there's not a huge difference between the ungrazed and appropriately grazed bunches. Both have robust root systems that will be able to provide moisture and nutrients to the plant. The overgrazed bunch, on the other hand, has a wimpy root system that will be unlikely to sustain the plant through a drought. To sum up the major points I hope you walk away with today, toxic plants can cause more issues than just animal loss. Just because you haven't had an animal die from consuming a toxic plant doesn't mean that you aren't being impacted by them or that you shouldn't act to control them. Second, weeds are never really your problem. They are the symptom of a bigger problem. And in order to fix your weed problem, you have to address the underlying cause. Which brings me to my final takeaway. Nothing but nothing replaces good grazing management. I appreciate you all sticking with me through this virtual rendition of Poison in the Pasture. I hope you feel a bit more confident identifying toxic weeds that might be in your pasture and understand the steps that you need to take to control and prevent them. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me at horseyGirl@ufl.edu. Ordinarily, this is the part of class where I would pass out a paper survey for you to complete before leaving. Instead, I'm going to ask that you please click the survey link in the video description. Completing this survey allows us to 1, measure the impact of our teaching, and 2, fine-tune our presentations to better meet your needs moving forward. We really appreciate the time you've spent with us today and look forward to getting back to working together face-to-face and on the farm when all of this is behind us. In the meantime, stay healthy, wash your hands, and keep your chins up.